why, or if you just have questions, you can do it that way as well. So as I mentioned, we have Victoria here today, and I asked her if she wanted to do a fun little experiential that I encourage all of you attendees to do as well. And if you've watched a webinar of ours already before, I have used this one because it's one of my favorites. So Victoria, I'm going to ask you before I stop sharing my screen so you can kind of get your bearings about you. Today, where you're at emotionally, spiritually, if you think about and take a few deep breaths, maybe closing your eyes. And again, attendees, please feel free to do this as well. When you close your eyes and you breathe deep down inside, what kind of landscape do you feel yourself as being today? So again, just taking a few deep inhales and releasing it. What kind of landscape do you feel like you are today? So Victoria, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and please feel free to share where you are today in terms of a landscape.
Well, I partially probably because I'm already at the mountains, but I do feel like the mountains. I feel really solid today, really firmly planted in this world, and I feel really like I just imagining the possibilities, reaching for the sky.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you engaging in that. I think it's just a nice way to begin. Attendees, if you want, you can go ahead and put where you envisioned yourself. You can put it in the chat, and we can go ahead and take a look at that. Again, welcome, Victoria. Glad to have you, and welcome to all you attendees. I'm excited for you all to be here and learn. I'm going to be learning alongside, so I'm excited to be taking notes.
Well, and thank you, Joe, and thank you, Mending the Sacred Hoop, for having me here today. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me and some of my background around working with housing, so you know where I come from. So I've been working to address violence against Indigenous women for about 36 years now. And actually, my early years of work started in Duluth, Minnesota. And in 1988, I started working in transitional housing. And at that particular time here in the United States, there were no transitional housing models that were focused on addressing domestic and sexual violence. And the transitional housing program that I was working in was created as a response, as an extension from shelter. The group of women that organized and developed that transitional housing had seen a transitional housing model and imagined the possibilities, having a longer period of time to be able to work with survivors in a supported environment to help them deal with the aftermath of violence. And I was fortunate to get hired as the first women's program coordinator. And I worked there for several years, and I provided direct service as well, then later moved to doing development work, not only with our transitional housing, but also toward the development of permanent housing options for victims. And then left there and went to American Indian Community Housing and was a founding member of that organization. And we created it as a response, not only to domestic and sexual violence, but to be able to address poverty and homelessness that our Native community experienced at higher rates. So I've been doing transitional housing work for a lot of years. And then in 2010, I started doing the National Tribal TA for OVW on transitional housing through the Recovery Act funding that came out around that time, and then have continued to provide the housing TA through Redwind. So we'll talk a little bit about why we need to have a response to housing, and then I'll move through and talk more specific about the model and the key aspects of it. So when we think about homelessness, it's really quite significant. And as a part of it, when we look at victims of domestic and sexual violence, we find really significant rates around women and children that are homeless. So homelessness is all over the United States. We see it a lot in our tribal communities as well. And unfortunately, we haven't developed really strong responses to it. So when we think about domestic violence and homelessness, that housing instability is 4 times more likely for women who have experienced DV compared to other women. And approximately 25% of homeless women have acknowledged that domestic violence has been a major contributor to their homelessness, and that we know that domestic violence victimization has been both direct and indirect pathways to homelessness. And for those of us that have been providing the direct service advocacy, what we know is that if we can't find stable housing, one of the things that happens is that survivor will often end up in a repeat pattern, going back to the abuser, trying to flee again, going back to the abuser, trying to flee again, which repeats multiple times. And so one of our best options is to create housing security, housing stability, and have affordable options for survivors, which that's all good and said, but at the same time, what we know in our different communities is that there's also such, huge limits in housing stock available. But I want to spend some time talking about housing first as a model. Oftentimes when people think about transitional housing, they think about it as we've got to get this property, we have a kind of a collection of properties to be able to put people into it. And years ago, as a part of some work that the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence did, they actually were funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look at housing first as a model for a response to domestic and sexual violence. And I was fortunate to be involved in working with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, also known as WSCDV. And they had, because of my housing background, they asked me to help facilitate the tribal cohort. And they had, through the Bill and Melinda Gates funding, they had a combination of resources, and they were providing grants to programs, advocacy programs in the state to help test, examine, and figure out how a housing first model could work for survivors. So when we think about safety, for survivors, that we really need to think about it as long-term stability. So housing is a key to that. As I mentioned about that cycle of a survivor that may flee to shelter, and if they can't find housing options and income to support themselves and have some supports dealing with all of the different issues that come from living with the violence, that there's this repeat pattern that happens. So when we talk about housing first, basically it's a model that was developed through housing programs across the United States. Some of the different community responses, they kept trying to figure out what are some of the best approaches to homelessness. Oftentimes people think that this is a model that HUD created, and in fact, it was a community-based model that got developed that caught on in multiple communities. And then through that work from the communities, it informed HUD to consider housing first as a viable option. So when we think about it, we're basically trying to get people into housing first. It's just that simple, that when we think about it as housing first, that a core part of that is that we're making sure that we're not waiting for something else to happen before we get people into housing. And I remember years ago with some of the housing work that I did, there were programs that had rules attached. You had to be sober for X amount of time to come into housing. You had to have certain type of income to come into housing. There were these different kinds of conditions that first you do these things, then you're eligible for some of this affordable housing. So through the community work that was going on, was seeing that those were barriers that people had that were real life barriers that really could more effectively be worked on if they had housing first, instead of trying to say, go get sober, go get on your feet and get a job, and then you can have housing. It's not an effective model for working with people who are homeless. And through the work that Wiskadiv was doing, they were working with advocacy programs and said, so how can we use this model in a way that's going to make sense for victims of domestic and sexual violence? And in that process, and the resources that they provided through grants to different advocacy programs in the state, the programs were given the freedom to imagine the possibilities. And after they had written the grant, if what they had said was their plan, that months in, they decided, wow, this isn't going to work at all. We need to shift this. There was no consequence for that. And they were completely supported to reimagine and to adjust to what they needed. And so when we think about housing first, one of the clear emphasis was, how do we get people that are fleeing into housing as quickly as possible, and maybe even avoiding the need to have to go into emergency shelter. And what we hear from survivors over the years with emergency shelter is that there's many survivors who say, yeah, it was, they were helpful, the place was comfortable, but I can't do that again. I can't bring my kids into another stressful situation. I need more privacy than what a shelter can offer. And there's multiple different stories that survivors will say that were challenges and barriers for them to think about shelter as an option. And so it's not to say that shelter is not a viable resource, because it really has its place in our resources for victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. But when possible, if we can get people moved into housing first, then we can help to stabilize them and to work through some of the challenges that people have. So when we think about the housing first principles, first is that housing is a basic right. And that comes back to that, that there's no conditions there in terms of, you've got to be sober to get housing. You've got to have a certain income to get housing. You have to be in a certain way to get housing. And so when it's as a basic right, it basically means that this person deserves to have housing as a human being and no other reasons than that. And that with that, the way you work with the participants within the program is that you really center values of respect, warmth, and compassion. And for me, when I think about it from a tribal context, is that we center our Indigenous values in that work. We bring in a relative-centered approach, and that we work with survivors in a way that treats them as our relative coming in, and that we're first a relative to that survivor, and second, a worker in our program. And what I mean by that is that when a survivor comes in, that our first goal is not to shove a bunch of papers under their nose and ask them to fill it out. Our first intent is to see how that survivor is and what that survivor needs, and to make that survivor comfortable and safe, and offer understanding to where they're at this time. Another principle is working with people as long as they need, which means that it's not going to be time limited. So when we think about housing first as a model, that some people may need longer than a year, longer than 18 months, longer than 2 years. And through my work with transitional housing, some of my early work back in the 80s had the requirement of an 18-month length of stay, and our funding was through HUD. And then they later extended it to 24 months. And this is pretty much what is followed through the statutory requirements as well through OVW funding, is that it's a maximum of 24 months. And I know through my work is that most of the time, that 24-month period, that 18 to 24 month was an ideal period. But there were those exceptions. We had one family that we worked with for 5 years, and it was critical. All of what they needed, the complicated issues that merged together for that family, for that parent, and those children in the household, and dealing with all of the different traumas, all of the different violence that family experienced, they needed a longer period of time. And so we worked to get extensions of time to be able to work with them as long as they needed work from us. And what we do know is that we want to create enough time and space for people to work on the issues that they need to, so that when they no longer have us involved in their lives, that they feel really solid and have the problem-solving skills and recognize the resources and how they can find those resources. And then another principle is around moving people to independent housing. So thinking about it in the context of our tribal transitional housing programs, primarily our tribal programs are working from basically a hybrid model of transitional housing, where they're not operating a specific facility, but providing rental subsidies to people so that they find housing, provide the subsidy on that space, and then the subsidy tapers away or ends at some point. And with that, it leaves people in their own housing, so they don't have to do an extra jump to move. But critically, in the time that the program is working with that household, is to recognize what's going to happen at the end of that subsidy. Can this household support that rental cost for the long term? Is it a reasonable rent that they're going to be carrying? So the work really needs to be thinking about, what do you need now for critical need to get into solid, stable housing? And then what are you going to need down the road? What's the long-term need? And what are the activities in between that can help people move in toward that place so that they can actually maintain that housing? So a lot of people that are doing homeless work, and when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about 30% or less of a person's income should go towards housing costs. That's kind of how affordable gets defined. And if people's incomes don't change, depending on the kinds of housing that they have, that could potentially work if they could afford it at this point and it was planned for down the road. But what we know with housing markets is that housing markets, the costs change, the costs increase. We recently here in Colorado, Colorado Springs actually is one of the hottest housing markets in the country right now. And what that means for working with survivors is that getting them into a rental unit where it projected a year from now, 2 years from now, based on current income, they should be able to afford it. But based on the housing market that we have here and how rents and mortgages are changing, housing purchases are changing so rapidly, that we could easily see that a year down the road, when a lease gets renewed, that person, even with a lot of planning, may not be able to afford it. So there's economic justice work that needs to happen as a part of it, to be able to ensure that that survivor has an ability to maintain long-term economic stability along with housing stability. They both go hand in hand. They're not separated. And And housing first principles are, one of them is separating housing from services. And what that means is it connects toward survivor autonomy. So basically what that means is survivors have the right to make the choices. And so when we think about housing services and housing connected in the two program and separating them, it means that you're not going to give consequences if that survivor in your program chooses not to participate in your services, and that all of the services are on a voluntary basis that you provide to that survivor, to the different people in your program and the different households in your program. And that can be challenging. Oftentimes I hear from people that, well, what if people don't have to do what we're offering in our program, then why are we even offering a program? And this goes back to when we think about one of the principles, treating clients with respect, warmth, and compassion, and working with them as long as those needs, those are core as a part of the program connections. So with a victim having the ability to make choices about what programs they want to participate in, they're going to participate in some of them based on the relationship you build with them. Because your job as a part of working in a program such as this is to build those connections and to help them to see their options. And for me, critically, when I think about that, is I want to do it in a way where I engage that survivor in identifying and finding their own solutions. So it's not me telling them, this is what you need to do here, and this is what you need to do there. Instead, I am working with them in ways to help them figure out their own solutions. And one of the ways we talk about that is that it's part of working with them in a way where we're asking them the questions. So what do you think that is going to be helpful for you? What are the options that you see that could be helpful for you? What do you see as your barriers, and how might you move through that? So we're asking them questions, not 20 questions in an interrogation way. We're conversationally engaging but as a part of it, instead of anytime they ask a question that we come back and say, oh, this is how it works and this is what you need to do. Instead, we come back and say, well, I'm hearing what you're saying and maybe paraphrasing it, but then coming back and asking them, well, what do you think you should do? I'm sure that inside of you, in your core, you know what you need to do, and helping them to figure that out. So the survivor autonomy and personal sovereignty is hand in hand. They're making their own decisions. They're the ones living with the outcome and the results of what the services that and programming they're seeking to use. Any choices they're making, they live with the outcomes. We as workers don't. And so it's an important part for us to make sure that we support them in figuring out not only their options, but what might be the potential challenges or shortcomings or consequences that could happen as a result of this choice or another one. So when we think about housing first, there's 4 core areas that are worked on. It's mobile advocacy, flexible engagement, community engagement, and centered with that trauma-informed practice. And for me, and these are the tenets that came out of the work that WSCA did, Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, engaged in with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through their multi-year project. And so trauma-informed practice for me, I always center that with relative-centered approaches because we're not just working from the trauma, we're working with the entire human being. So I just want to connect to that in there. So when we think about mobile advocacy, and this was something that I actually learned when I first started doing transitional housing work, one of my coworkers said, "Don't be attached to your desk." And at first it was like, well, that just was a weird concept. But clearly it actually became really central to being able to meet people where they are at. And as a part of that, it's meeting with them in their space, meeting them in a park, meeting in a library, different places to give an environment for them that they find comfortable. And then with that, we're accompanying them on their journey. So it's not that we're sitting back and we're saying, here's a referral, go call them, go do this, go do that. We're instead being part of that with them. If they want me to go with them to this one meeting to help them and support them, it's really about doing more engaged advocacy. And again, it takes me back to some of the earlier years of advocacy where we were out and about all the time working with survivors where they were at, helping them maneuver the different systems, and we were engaged with them along the way. And with that, we're also doing safety planning in a dynamic approach. Over the years, as I have worked with different tribes and different programs, one of the things that's been surprising are the number of advocates that have thought that you do safety planning on first contact and that's good enough, and don't continually engage in that process. And what we know about the impacts of violence and perpetrator and offender behavior is that they change a lot. If one strategy is not working, they find a new strategy, and it can change in a moment. And so our job in this work is to work not only to work with that survivor to help them think about safety in the multiple settings that they live and move through, but also to be building the skill with them so that they're starting to do their safety planning without us, so that they're learning how to make plans and strategies for them and their household in all of the different settings over the multiple years they're going to have to deal with this offender that may not leave their lives. That victim may have children in common with that offender and may have a lifetime connection because of birthdays and graduations and weddings and births and things like that. So safety planning is a completely engaged long-term process as well. And then it's holistic focus. So that's part of connecting to what I say about being relative centered, that we're looking at the comprehensive needs of what this particular individual and household needs. And that means that how are they recovering from the violence? So what are the traumas that they're dealing with that need attention, and how can we support them in getting that support to work through that, as well as the physical needs that they may have and the medical issues that may come from either the physical violence or the long-term emotional and mental effects that household has carried. So we're working with that entire individual, but then we're thinking about the relationship between that non-offending parent and the children that are living in that household and rebuilding those relationships. Because we also know that through the violence undermined that parental authority of that non-offending parent, as well as the children have lost the connection to their role as children. Some of them have assumed adult roles and maybe have assumed roles of attempting to be protectors. So trying to help that household rework their dynamics as a family unit, and to be able to engage in their own healing individually and collectively together. And then when we talk about it, we do it all through flexible engagement. And we want to make sure we have resources. So this is critical as you're developing your program and you're planning through your grant writing, that you build in place the resources to be able to be flexible to meet the needs. And that's going to mean different things to different people. So maybe something unexpected came up and they didn't make their rent, and that having an ability to come back and deal with that at a later time and not be rigidly stuck on a major schedule, and being able to have those financial assistance type resources to be able to be responsive to that, as well as being able to meet some of the other needs. Maybe they need to get a tire replaced for their car because their tire is so old and worn, and it's not repairable anymore. Maybe they need new shoes for that job interview that they're going to. Our advocate programs, so through Redwood, we operate the HSEA advocate program here in Colorado Springs, and we operate transitional housing. And we have a place that we call our sister's closet that the advocates put together and have collected and sorted donations and have nice quality secondhand clothing closet that's available for survivors to come and pick out clothing for interviews, appointments, job starts, things like that to help them. And then having funds to be able to go that next step further. Maybe when they start their job, they don't have the resources for childcare. So being able to come in with some resources with that. So all of that is to be flexible, and at the same time, to have engagement also that's not linear. Some people have, I've seen some programs where they've had like, we do X, Y, and Z for each person, and that's what we do, and that's the order we do it in. And the reality is people's lives change a lot, and what they may think they need now may not be as critical as something else that emerges, and later, something else critical may emerge. And so the way we engage needs to go with based on the way that household needs it. I have found from my own experience in doing this work that that there's waves of what people need. So initially there's kind of like that initial, like, okay, so we've got housing, we've got furniture that we need. We've dealt with some of the immediate medical care. We've got kids in school, and everybody wants to stop and breathe for a little while. And so then that was like a first wave, and they kind of back off, and it's like, no, I don't really have any questions. I don't have any needs. And then after they've caught their breath and kind of had that space to settle in, then comes another wave of thinking about, wow, I'm in this place, and now I'm starting to be concerned about when the subsidy runs out. How can I get ready for that? And other kinds of things like that. I'm realizing my kids are not listening to me, and my one child needs more attention. That child was old enough to hear and understand more of the abuse, and I'm seeing some trauma with that. And so another wave happens, and it'll come in waves like that, and then that gets kind of worked on, and then it kind of stabilizes for a little bit, and it comes back to another wave. And I think about it, I've been using the term wave, and so as you think about water, like it'll come in, and then as it comes into the shore, it pulls back, and then it builds again, and it comes in, and it comes back. And when we think about the kind of waves that people have in terms of needs, is that they're kind of figuring stuff out a little bit, and then it's building, and then it comes in, and I need help with this, this, and this, and then it pulls back. So thinking about it, even about literal waves. And so then also thinking about partnerships. Community engagement is a critical part of what makes all this successful. Because it's a comprehensive approach, not any one program is going to have all those different kinds of resources. So partnerships with housing providers to be able to have access to housing when you need it. That's with different landlords, that's with your tribal housing authority. And and being able to know what the requirements are for that housing and to work with them to notify you as soon as there's openings so you can get your people in as quickly as possible. And then partnerships with other community resources. So when you think about those resources, that can be a whole range of different things. You could be needing help with alcohol and drug care, treatment and care and recovery for the non-offending parent. They may have been using alcohol as a crutch to help survive these violent situations, and now they are still using it and need some help figuring things out, figuring out the kind of problem that they've got with it, and what are some resources and tools to help them let go of it. Being able to figure out some of the parenting areas, as well as the care, whether it's behavioral health or different kinds of other programs that offer therapy for children and youth, as well as for the adult. And then also thinking about all of the different cultural kind of resources. You might have them and have developed them within your program, but if your program doesn't have those abilities to do that, then you might be reaching out to other programs. So again, I'll give an example. So within our HSEA advocate program, our advocates, so it's an all-native, urban native advocate program, and our advocates have created what we call our Indigenous Healing Garden. And through that, we have some land that was donated to our program. And in that garden, they've created a large medicine wheel out of stones. And then in each of the quadrants of the wheel, they have planted traditional medicines. And they have solstice gatherings and full moon ceremonies. We have a sweat lodge on the property at the garden as well, so that they can run sweats periodically. And we have a woman, an elder that is the pour for the traditional sweat. As well, there's outdoor yoga that takes place, which has been perfect during COVID to have an outdoor space to hold activities, and it's large enough where people can spread out and social distance. And then we have partnerships with the Denver Indian Center that has a jobs and training program, which is culturally specific, that can come into work with our survivors in our program to help them engage in job readiness and to do the preparation work to get ready to do job searches. And we have other programs in the community that our advocates have partnered with to bring in a range of different resources to the program. And then the trauma-informed practice about building emotional safety and respecting and honoring survivor autonomy, and creating an environment for survivors to restore their own ability to make choices and decisions and have control over their lives. And then we facilitate connections. So we don't just send people out. We make sure that the connection is made the way the survivor wants it. If they want just a phone number and to be sent on their way, then we'll do that. If they would like us to make the phone call and create an opening for them to talk to somebody and help them and even go with them to an appointment, we'll do that. And it varies from person to person based on what they need. And then the healing process is another critical part of it. So our advocate program has built connections with traditional spiritual people in the community to offer one-to-one spiritual work, as well as to support our survivors engaging in ceremony, and then our cultural activities that we provide within our program. And one of the things we also do is because of where we're located here in Colorado, here on the Front Range of the Rockies, there's approximately 100 different tribes that are represented in our community. And so with that, we try to make sure the traditional medicines that we keep have enough to enough variety to meet the multiple different needs of the tribes that we're serving in our area. So a little bit more thinking about flexible funding. So when we think about that, is making sure that the funding that is available for this particular model has the understanding of the philosophy of domestic violence to provide individualized survivor-centered services. And I know through OVW, through the tribal government's funding, that it comes from a flexible funding approach. To some degree, it's got some limits. And the critical piece in there is for you all, as a part of designing and developing your program, is to talk about your approach in there. Through Redwin, we work with programs to develop their policies. And one of the things that we often see is that people aren't thinking about the scope of their program with a lot of depth. They have some aspects of it thought through, but there's a lot that they haven't even considered. And it's important to really understand the range of what Housing First approach is, so that when you're writing your grants and designing your program, that you're creating that flexibility in there and describing the scope, the full range of what you can offer. So being able to recognize that you're going to be involved with people in different ways. And so when we think about what is called light touch, are going to be those households who really don't need a lot of heavy involvement, that checking in periodically, making some referrals, providing a little bit of financial assistance could be plenty. And my experience is that this is not going to be the norm for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, but it will occur. You will have some households that only need a light touch. And at the same time, in working in housing for me, just when I thought that we were bringing in a household that needed a light touch, I found that they really needed a lot more investment in time. And it has to do with how people can present themselves. And sometimes as a part of surviving trauma, people kind of sit up strong and present themselves with the strong image. And then yet, you know, when they kind of get that space to take those deep breaths and relax, then they may crumble in that process. So it means that they might need a much larger investment of time and energy, as well as resources, to help them as they've crumbled to gather all the pieces and rebuild that back together. And I think critically in there, when we think about the resources we pull together and our approach, is recognizing what unique opportunities that we have working with survivors in this environment. That critically, this is an opportunity to work with survivors with more depth. And it's important for those that are doing this work to understand what that means and to be prepared to go at all three levels, to work from a light touch, to work with a flexible engagement, and to dive in wholeheartedly all the way, because that's going to make the difference. And this window of opportunity we have with survivors may not come back again. It may be a short-lived opportunity to build that relationship, build that connection, and to help make these critical changes. And our job is to create the environment for all of that to happen. So how does Housing First work? So one of the things through the WSCADIV project, what they did was not only were they working with the different programs in the state of Washington that were funded, they were also doing an evaluation on the project to take a look at and see what made a difference. And through that process, what they saw was that with a housing first model, being able to come in a flexible approach, flexible resources, being well connected to community resources, that they found that 18 months down the road, survivors retained their housing. Almost all of them retained their housing for 18 months. And what I have seen as a part of the work that I have done over the years around housing, if people aren't prepared to do the long-term work and they get locked in of, well, geez, it's a lot to pay for rent, so let's just work with people for 6 months, that when people cut that amount of time working together, that the long-term impact drops significantly. So we end up seeing that the shorter the program is, the more housing instability that survivors deal with. And that has to do with the comprehensive needs that people have. So when we look at a survivor of domestic violence, what we know from our own experience is that domestic violence didn't happen one time, that it was a pattern of coercive behavior. And in that process, there were multiple things that were acting. So when we think of the tactics of power and control, we can think about all of those different 8 tactics that played out and were used against that survivor and had direct impacts on the children. Oftentimes survivors will say things like, well, my kids never saw the violence. But I would imagine that those children saw those tactics playing out. They saw the tactics of emotional abuse that were being used. They were used as the tactics as children, being told things about their parent, their non-offending parent, that no child should probably ever hear about that parent. They were seeing that parent's authority being undermined. They were seeing minimizing, denying, and blaming, even after they may have heard the violence themselves. So that whole household has been deeply impacted by not only the physical violence and the sexual violence, but they've also been impacted by the different tactics of violence. And so that recovery for it really needs a longer period of time from it in dealing with that. And I know myself, and I'll just share a little disclosure of my own experience. I had previously been in an abusive relationship way back 30 some and into 40 years ago. And I was with him in that relationship for 10 years. And after I got out of that relationship, there was a period I spent 6 months where I was defined as homeless. So I didn't have permanent housing. I couch surfed. There were a few nights I slept in my car. And through half of that time, my ex had taken my children and wasn't allowing me to have access and was keeping them away from me. And it took some very strong actions to get my children returned. And so during that 6 month period, 3 months without my children, 3 months with my children, when we finally got housing, moving into that housing, which I thought, I could keep a good house, I could cook pretty well, I was a good mom. And it was like I forgot how to cook. Just with that time away from having a home, and was constantly burning food. I struggled with being organized in the house, struggled with putting in place routines. My kids were angry with everything that had happened. I was overwhelmed. And when I think about all of that, it didn't go away overnight. It took us a couple years to get past those immediate effects in terms of that process of fleeing that violence. That would be the more immediate stuff that we had to deal with. But then we had to deal with that 10 years of all of what took place in there, rebuild relationships, rebuild our individual senses of self and our roles, as well as collectively rebuild how we engaged and interacted with each other. And at the same time, I was going to college. I was trying to figure out how I was going to support my children. All of that stuff was happening at the same time. And in the end, in retrospect, it was probably a really powerful time in my life because of the independence that I gained through that period, the strength of self that I recognized I had, the closeness my children and my family and I had as a result of all of the work we did, but it was also the hardest time in my life. And so I just give you that personal story as an example to think about the lives of the people that you're working with. On the surface, it may look like things are all fine, but yet there's still quite a bit of work that has to happen. So I want to share this one story about rocks. And it was actually a story that was told to me by a medicine woman when I was working at American Indian Community Housing Organization in Duluth. We used to have her come in and she worked with our staff as we were developing our culturally specific programming through both our transitional housing and our emergency shelter work that we were doing. And she really talked to us about rocks. And one of the pieces about the stories that she talked to us was about recognizing the life of rocks. And for us at that time, with me living in Duluth, having the shore of Lake Superior nearby, with one shore having a sandy beach and the other shore having a lot of rocks on it, we had conversations about that. And she talked about the journey of rocks and that the rocks that are there on the shore, they're just there, that a lot of us don't recognize the long journey that they have gone through to get where they're at. And that when we think about the shores of Lake Superior and where those rocks are, that those rocks traveled many, many, many miles to get there onto that shore and to just be there. And then for me as a person walking on that shore, when I look at those rocks, I just see them. I don't see that journey that they went through. And that the reason I'm talking about the journey of rocks is thinking about the journeys of the people that we work with. And that there are times that we're working with people and we may be working with them for a year and in some cases a couple years, and it doesn't feel like things are really moving. It feels like there's a lot of work for me as an advocate, that I may be working really hard and it feels like we're doing stuff, but it feels like we're almost kind of stuck in place. And if any advocate gets to that place, I want to remind you of the journeys of rocks, that we may not be seeing the movement of that person, but that person is definitely moving, and they're moving slow and steady, and they're getting where they need to be, and they will get there exactly when they're supposed to be there. And my experience over the years that I've done direct service advocacy, that there have been times I have worked with people, and in that process have wondered, am I being effective? Am I making a difference? I feel like I'm just not getting anywhere. And then, and then our relationship may part, and I still may feel that. And then I've been fortunate in a few instances where people have reached back 2, 3, 4, 5 years later and have called me and said, I just want to acknowledge all the difference that happened as a part of being in that program. and that what I learned from you. And then for me, what a gift I had been given to receive that. And at the same time, it also really validated the importance of, even if you're not seeing the movement, the critical engagement that is so important to making the difference in people's lives. And if you're fortunate in that process as an advocate, you'll have an opportunity to see what difference was made. And at the very least, know that they're on their journey just as the rocks are. So I just want to stop here and share information with you. You can reach out to Redwind through the email at info@red-wind.net. Goes into one staff and they direct it to the appropriate staff to respond to it. And then also on our website, on our Contact Us page, we have a button to make a request for TA. So if you have any kind of a request for housing TA, definitely reach out to us. We'll reach back, set up a time to have a conversation with you and see how we can help and support you with that. So I'd also like to see if there's any questions based on anything that I've covered up to this point. So definitely you can put that in the Q&A box and we'll respond from there.
I'm keeping an eye on the question and answer box here. Valerie mentioned earlier as you were sharing your presentation, how grateful she was because she's going to be able now to better explain the reasoning for trauma-informed care. So that's just something to comment on and note. And as people do type in their questions, I also want to mention, I wrote down so many things. Victoria, what a great presentation. So much information in there. It was fantastic. One of the things that I love and is very obvious as you continued through your presentation is that you meet people as a relative first, and then you said a worker second, which just as you're going through the processes of all the different things that you guys do, it's clear that that's the way you lead. And what a fantastic way, fantastic model for the rest of us participating here. And the other thing that I really enjoyed you talking about, because it's so true, there's so many different programs that propose to help survivors are very linear in terms of this is what we do first, this is what we do second, here we go, you know, check the boxes. And you're just describing it as waves of support is exactly what it is. It's the waves come up and crest when they do, and nobody can predict that. No time frame, no, you know, policy and procedure. So I just really appreciated that as well.
Well, thank you for that, Jill. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it was very informative. If there's anybody that would like to ask a question, I can unmute you as well if you're more comfortable doing that. Just raise your hand and I will gladly do that. Any other thoughts? And that window of opportunity too, you mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm just looking down my giant list of things I wrote down, but how you said it's true. You have a window of opportunity to work with survivors. So utilize it, you know, and be willing to get more in depth and be flexible and engage however it is they need to be engaged. Flexibility for me has always been key, and that's not always easy to come by for a lot of folks. Thank you, Beth, for joining us. All right, well, I don't think there's any questions coming in. It doesn't appear to be. Do you have any more thoughts before signing off for today, Victoria?
I just want to just kind of piggyback what you were saying about the window of opportunity, that we really, as advocates, do powerful, powerful work. And it's powerful for us because of the strength it builds within us as a part of doing that, and being able to participate in the personal lives of many, many different people. And so it's critical for us to be focused and on what that survivor needs, so that we can be engaged and ready in a way that's going to make the difference for them. And if we miss that opportunity, we don't know if we're going to get another one again. And our work is really, it's sacred work as a part of being able to be involved in that personal aspect of their lives. There are so many, many things that I've heard from survivors over the years about their experiences. And it's stuff that goes beyond the protection of confidentiality. It's about the creating an environment of privacy, respect, safety, and comfort for those survivors to open up and do what they need to do at that time. And I do just want to say thank you to everybody joining us today. I've really appreciated this opportunity. The working on housing stuff is one of my favorite areas, because we really do have a longer opportunity to work with people to help make the difference in people's lives. I've worked in crisis responses, and I've worked in emergency shelter, and having the ability to work longer, we can really make lasting changes and really impact future generations. So thank you all for all that you do. And please do reach out if you've got any questions or want to sound anything off of us related to housing at Redwood. And thank you, Mending the Sacred Hoop, for having me on this webinar today.
Oh, very grateful for you. Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us today. Really just so much information. As you're speaking there again, I wanted to piggyback on a few more things that you said, but I'm going to let people go. So, thank you so much, Victoria. To everyone, have a wonderful rest of your, what day are we on? Wednesday today. Hopefully the sun is shining wherever you all are. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.